It's a weird feeling when you walk out the theater and think, hey, I actually really like that movie. And then everyone starts shitting on it. Most of the time when that happens to me, I understand where they're coming from, but sometimes I look past their flaws and think, you know what, there's definitely some problems with it, but I still really liked it. I wanted to start off with DC because there's a certain film that I've loved basically my whole life, but it never got the love that I think it deserves. DC is a weird one because most of its movies are shit. And before I move on, I am not a Snyder fanboy. Don't you dare associate me with that fucking fanbase. I just so happen to enjoy some, not all of his movies, including my favorite movie as a 12-year-old kid, Man of Steel. I feel like people remember this movie as simply an action movie without much character depth or a compelling story. But I firmly disagree. It's a story of a character who is different from everyone else. A person who has the ability to save people, however is restricted in doing so because people would fear him if they found out about his abilities. The movie turns into a story of choice. Russell Crowe explains that Krypton lost something valuable to them.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious. The element of choice, of chance. What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her?
This movie showed me how much power you really have. You have the choice to do whatever you want, something the Kryptonians lacked. Now, of course, people have a lot more restrictions with what they can do, but this includes Superman. For his entire life up until this point, he treated his powers as a curse rather than a blessing due to what he was told in his upbringing.
People are afraid of what they don't understand.
He feels restricted with his potential and feels like he's wasting his talents, until he finally meets someone who gives him the right advice and has the knowledge to help him achieve his dream of changing the world. Something us as people try to find in our lives as well. Which then leads into his choice to finally fulfill his destiny and become Superman. Backed up with one of my favorite ever movie soundtracks, In Flight, all of which combines into one of my favorite superhero scenes I've ever seen. For the first time in his life, he's able to finally achieve his dream of consistently saving people without living in fear of what others think of him. Also, Zod is a really good villain. Like, I completely understand his motivations. He foresaw Krypton's demise and offered a solution, and he was denied. Even after his planet blew up, he was still Krypton's savior as he could have built a new world. And so Superman got in his way, and the fight scenes are so fucking cool. And that's another thing I really like about this movie. The action. Usually when the characters are super fucking fast, there's some slow motion or you can't even see the character and they kind of just slam into each other. But here we get to see everything and it's fucking sick. But because these guys are so strong, they have to throw things at each other and slam into some buildings, and as a result, people fucking die everywhere. And this is a problem for a lot of people. It's one angle I can understand for the people who don't like this movie, and that is the character of Superman. As someone who has watched a fuck ton of DC animated movies and series, I totally get it. This interpretation of the character is super different. He does save people, but he also causes a lot of deaths. And the real Superman would never do that. Like, was this really necessary? But honestly, despite that, I love this version of him. Don't get me wrong, I love Superman when he's nice. He's actually very inspiring in his stories, and I prefer his interpretation in the Justice League show than in Man of Steel. But as someone who also loves injustice, I love a mean Superman. And the movies recognize that he's a threat to this world. Immediately in the next film in Batman v Superman, we see that Batman fucking hates him because he caused the destruction of the entire city. And he's right, by the way, Superman really fucked up. And for those of you who've seen my favorite film soundtracks, you'd know that Man of Steel is in fact my favorite movie soundtrack ever. It's a soundtrack that elevates this movie's themes of hope and choice. But when there's some action playing, the music is also super thrilling. If you've never listened to the soundtrack before, there's a link in the description for a Man of Steel soundtrack suit that I absolutely adore. This isn't a partnership or anything, I just think they did a fantastic job. Man of Steel is the most underrated DC film, as I think it's the best one, which is a very unpopular opinion, and it has the most underrated film soundtrack, as it's quite rare to see people put it in Hans Zimmer's top 10, let alone top 5. Some of the songs you can't even find on Spotify. I fucking love this movie, and it ranks dangerously high in my all-time ranking. Marvel will be discussed later in the video, but I firstly want to talk about a franchise that has been shit for 3 decades now, and that is the Terminator franchise. I used to love these movies as a kid. Not these ones, but these ones. I watched Terminator Genesis twice in one day when I was like 11 for some reason. And I really don't know why, because that movie is not very good. I've thankfully recognized that the first 2 films are excellent and are unanimously agreed to be the best 2 Terminator films in the whole franchise. However, that third spot is quite heavily debated between all 4 of these movies. And the one I believe is the best out of these 4, and therefore the most underrated, is Terminator Salvation. Now, I want to clarify, that this movie is not that good. I loved it as a kid and I rewatched it the other day, and it's got some dumb shit in it, but it's still kind of fun and definitely better than the other three. First of all, I fucking love the aesthetic, atmosphere, and world this movie takes place in. Admittedly, some of the green screen looks like absolute shit, but it still captures the overall post-apocalyptic vibe. The sound design is so fucking cool as well. And then bikes start rolling down, like that's so sick. I'm sorry, I know these things don't make better storytelling or characters, but for me it just makes me like the movie so much more. Also, the directing at some points is actually really good. I loved that long take when Worthington was escaping the base. Now, all of these movies have the Terminator coming back in time in order to stop a younger John Connor. However, we finally get to see John Connor as a full-grown adult in the war. And that's a huge reason why I would infinitely prefer this movie over the others. Think about it like this. Let's say you decide to watch all 6 Terminator movies in 1 week. Every single fucking movie has a Terminator go back in time and try to stop the war before it ever even happens. This is the only movie where we actually get to see the war. So I'm looking forward to this movie because it's the most different in the whole franchise. It doesn't live in the past and deliver a story we've already seen. Okay, technically Dark Fate takes place 25 years after Terminator 2, but that movie doesn't take place in the war, plus I fucking hate that movie with a passion. And people say that Salvation is worse than Dark Fate. That's absolutely criminal to me. At least this movie doesn't ruin the original movies. And plus the characters are actually a lot better. This is my favorite version of John Connor out of these 3. I love that even though victory is right at the palm of his hands, he still decides to delay the attack and save everyone who's in there. He's actually a good person. He's also got some aura to him. He literally gets relieved of his command and says, fuck that, I'm gonna save everyone anyway. But I do have to say, Christian Bale sometimes does his Batman voice, and it's really fucking distracting.
If I let you down, you'll kill everyone in this room.
If you're working alone, wear a mask.
Beyond that though, he doesn't really go much deeper than that. But I was actually really invested into Sam Worthington's character. Someone who wholeheartedly believes he's a man, turns out to be a Terminator. However, uses that curse into a blessing and finally gets a second chance at the end of the movie, which he's wanted since the beginning of the film. This is also the first time we as an audience are seeing this world. So to have this character go through the world for the first time as well helps the audience immerse into the world. I really like that scene where Skynet finds him, but he's a Terminator, so he doesn't get caught. And so you can see that he's still hurt from that reveal. This movie even hints at you that he's a Terminator before the reveal. You can really tell this movie does try. This girl though, she fucking sucks. She has a certain scene that should have not been in the movie and adds nothing to the overall story. And Skynet is actually horrible, like genuinely a joke at the last act. The plan just makes no fucking sense. Honestly, there's so much wrong with this movie, so don't go ahead and watch it and expect a really underappreciated gem. But you'll probably appreciate the atmosphere, action, and little character moments, which is a lot more than you could say for the other Terminator movies. It's basically the best movie out of Bad Bunch. Now moving on to a franchise that is all over the fucking place. You could present a movie to a Star Wars fan and half of them would call it overrated, whereas the other half will swear by it. My pick for the most underrated Star Wars movie is liked by quite a few people, but also disliked by a lot more. And that is The Force Awakens. Although Solo is also really good, you should watch that. Now, the Disney trilogy has been clowned on ever since this movie was released. However, what really made people hate this trilogy were the next 2 movies. The entire trilogy is so looked down upon that it has gradually diminished The Force Awakens. If those 2 movies were good, or even just never came out, I really think a lot more people would appreciate this movie. And here's an example. Remember this fella? The man who starts off as a stormtrooper and decides to switch sides in order to help Rey? That in itself is a really cool idea for a character. He knows how to beat the enemy because he was part of them. I love it so much when someone that's part of the evil side turns to good and then uses that information to beat them. I really like Finn in this movie. And some people will look at me weird for saying that. And I agree, Finn isn't a good character anymore. And it's because he's hopelessly awful in the next 2 movies. But in this one, he's legitimately really likable with a really good character transformation. He goes from a stormtrooper who watches his colleagues murder innocent people at a village and says, nah, fuck that. I don't like this. I'm gonna try and kill the guy responsible for this. His chemistry with Rey was awesome to see because we see a man who witnessed countless deaths that he himself was a part of. But then he meets the most enthusiastic person in the entire franchise, which helps him develop an arc to help people just like she does. I really like that about Rey. She's just a joy to watch. What I really don't like about her though, is that she uses the Force for plot convenience. But at least it's present the least in this movie compared to the next 2. You know who else is awesome in this movie? Kylo fucking Ren. If you mildly inconvenience him, be prepared to get really hurt. But at the same time, he struggles to maintain his evil, Sometimes he just doesn't want to be in the dark side. He's like the one thing that's decent across the whole trilogy. That and the visuals. You can say what you want about this trilogy, but you have to agree that this trilogy looks absolutely gorgeous. One small attention to detail is that Rey has never really explored the galaxy before. So even though us as an audience know what it's like to go on these adventures, this movie still feels fresh because it's completely new for her, which I really appreciate. If you watch these movies in release order, you're gonna fucking love this movie because to me, it's a lot better than the prequels. There's so much energy, the jokes are funnier, and I'm not falling asleep the whole time. I'd go as far to say that this is the most fun I've had watching a Star Wars movie. Sure, I was a lot more invested into the world and story of the original trilogy, mainly because the tone is quite different. But if we're talking about pure fun, I'd have to go with this film. So yeah, super fun movie. I could just throw it on without ever really getting bored. We now reached the conclusion of this video, the most underrated film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There are actually quite a few underrated Marvel movies now. Similarly to the Star Wars sequels, the older movies are being overshadowed by the shitty new ones. I considered options like Ant-Man, and I heavily considered Guardians 2 as I think it's the best one in the trilogy, but my pick is Iron Man 3. This film is extremely split between people. A lot of people didn't like this film when it came out, however a few of us really liked it. Whilst it's certainly not as good as the first film, I really had a lot of fun with this one. The biggest reason why I think this movie is so underrated is because people prefer the second movie of the third, which is crazy to me because that second film is actually kind of shit. And also because the people really didn't like the Mandarin twist.
Don't hurt the face, I'm an actor.
But I actually thought it was really clever. We didn't need another villain. This guy's enough for the story, and speaking of, he's actually a pretty decent villain. I mean, his powers are pretty lame, he's like a worse version of the Human Torch, but he's charismatic and his diversion to target the Mandarin rather than himself was quite smart. And the way Tony beats him in the end was so fucking cool, jumping in between all of his Iron Man suits, and that's a big reason why I really like this movie. The action. A big criticism that I agree with a lot of Marvel movies is that the action is kinda mid. In some movies they're great, especially when they're working together, but then other times, you have wizards with magical powers, and rather than using them, they do some fucking karate. This movie is a huge exception though. It has some of the most thrilling sequences in the entire franchise. Tony Stark's house gets blown the fuck up, and he retaliates by shooting a fucking piano at the helicopter. He saves people from a plane, and he even beats someone without his suit whilst handcuffed. That's just so fucking cool. And by constantly having action scenes without his suit, there is so much more tension because he's basically invincible when he has the suit. He gets brutally beaten up in this movie, not just physically but mentally as well. Now, I love Bruce Wayne probably more than Tony Stark, but one thing I always thought was that out of these two billionaires, Tony Stark has always been the more relatable one. He's such a big mess, he goes through mental breakdowns, and his biggest weakness is letting his emotions get the better of him. I mean, he literally gives his address to the public just because he was mad. He might be a genius, but I think it's really cute how he does a lot of dumb shit. It makes his character a lot more compelling in my opinion. Man, I really miss good characters in the MCU. Although this movie does do something that really bothers me, which is that Tony realizes that he's Iron Man too much and takes away from his normal life. And so at the end of the movie, he's like, nah, you know what, let's improve my relationship with Pepper Potts and get my life together. But then 2 years later, he's back to being Iron Man. It was such a confusing ending that the end of the movie had to clarify that he's coming back. It feels like a mistake. Honestly, that's probably one of the reasons why this movie is so forgotten, is that the future movies don't really respect it. It's like this movie never really existed. Anyways, here's one of the reasons why the MCU used to be so great though. He is psychologically affected by the previous Avengers film. You have to plan that ahead years in advance in order for that to make sense. And so it feels rewarding watching previous Marvel films in order to get the full experience of its sequels. Is it as underrated or even as good as Man of Steel? No, I wouldn't say so. But similarly to the other movies on this list, I'm very excited to watch this movie if I was ever to rewatch the MCU. When I think of Iron Man, I tend to think of this movie. And I have a feeling that a lot of you probably think of his other films. Hence why I think Iron Man 3 is the most underrated Marvel film.
I'm the best.
Alright, so there we have it. Let me know how you guys think about my picks. I'd love for you guys to give me your answers as well. I could definitely make a part 2 of this video in the future if you guys are interested. Or I could also do the most overrated movie of each franchise. I'd be happy to do both, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday with another tier list ranking. See ya!